Welcome to another episode of the Film Florida podcast. My name is John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Thanks for downloading this episode of the podcast. Today, we talk visual effects. Before I introduce our guest, a few reminders. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. Also, we recently launched a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit teespring.com/stores/Film Florida to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, and coffee mugs. Today, our guest is Adam Howard. Adam is an award-winning visual effects supervisor with more than 3 decades of experience in the feature film and television industry. Adam's credits include Birdman, Titanic, Pirates of the Caribbean 2: Dead Man's Chest, Star Wars Episode 3: Revenge of the Sith, Master and Commander, Mission Impossible 3, Apollo 13, Star Trek: The Next Generation, and The Simpsons, just to name a few. And of course, most importantly, I'm kidding, Adam is a member of Film Florida. Here's our conversation with Adam Howard. Thanks for taking time to talk with us today, Adam.
My pleasure, thanks.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. How did you get your start in the industry?
I originally started as a graphic designer, and I was working at ABC Television in Melbourne, Australia. And it was all pre-computers, and so there was no Mac, there was no IBMs, there were no laptops, there was no Photoshop, and none of that stuff. All of the graphics that we were doing for on-air graphics were done by hand. So the state of the art at the time was, Pantone paper and Letraset and scalpels, glue, sticky tape, paint brushes. And that was the way I was doing it for about the first 3 months that I was there. And one day the art director called me and he said, "Look, we have this thing sitting in a box in the hallway. No one really knows much about it. You've got the least program commitments, so you've got some more time. Why don't you put it together and see what you think? And when it's a piece of rubbish, let us know and we'll get rid of it." Because we'd been assessing other computer systems, but they were all CAD systems, more kind of architectural-based things, and nothing like what we needed to do to use for on-air graphics. So we put it together, and it was the Quantel paint box, which ultimately became known as the classic paint box. It was one of the first paint boxes in the world. There were literally just a handful of them around the planet, mainly in London, New York, Los Angeles. And then there was this one in Australia that was going around as a demo. And it was the first system to have a pen and tablet as we know it now, although the tablet it weighed about as much as your car. It was made of solid steel, and it was crazy, and the pen and the cable attached to it were metal as well. But it was an amazing moment for me because I remember putting the pen to the tablet and seeing the cursor move, and I'd played piano before. And so I was used to looking at music and playing and not looking at my hands. And it was the same kind of concept, not looking at your hands, but looking at the screen and seeing the cursor move around. We looked at this system, and within minutes, I was just blown away. And so I went to the art director the next morning, and I said, "Okay, well, you need to sit down this time because this is an amazing thing." And I said, "This is the next major industrial revolution staring us in the face, just like the steam engine did. And one day there's going to be something like this in everything that we do. We have to get on this bandwagon right now." And I said, "I know I'm the youngest one in the department. I'm 17. I'm the last one you should be listening to for what was a $2.5 million investment, but you've got to get this thing now." And to my amazement, they bought it. And I ended up running the department for a while, which was fantastic. And we didn't really realize that at the time, what we were doing, every time we put the pen to the tablet, we were setting the groundwork for a brand new industry because it completely revolutionized the television graphics industry. And I looked at it as another tool, as an animation tool, and so I did the very first animation in the Southern Hemisphere anyway that was done on a digital system. And it was a really cool system, and it was a great way to get into something that was brand new.
So when you look back, that job, obviously, what you thought it was versus what it ended up being is completely different. Did you have any concept career-wise where you wanted to go, or at that time were you just a guy that liked graphics and needed a job?
No, I knew what I wanted to do. When I was 5 years old, I remember watching a kids' TV show, and there was a shot of a costume character in a sports stadium running down a staircase toward the camera, and he was trying desperately to get to the camera, and he would get halfway down and pop back to the beginning, and then get 3/4 of the way down and pop back to the beginning. And I remember that really affecting me and thinking, how did they do that? And so effects of whatever kind it was like an early passion. Then when I was 10 years old, I had a lesson at a magic store in Melbourne. And I remember this guy, Gerald Taylor, who's 92 now, he's still around in Melbourne, was a beloved magician in Australia. And I have a class with him, and he said, I said to him, so what tricks are you going to teach me? And he said, well, I'm not going to teach you any tricks. And I looked at him and I said, well, really? I thought that's why I was here. And he goes, no. And I said, well, what are you going to teach me? And he said, I'm going to teach you magic. And I said, well, what's the difference? And he goes, well, there's the rub. He goes, you see, watch this. And he put his hand in front of me, and he put a coin in the middle of his hand, and he said, watch this coin very closely. And he closed his hand, and he opened it, and it was gone. And my eyes bugged out of my head like a Tex Avery cartoon, total kind of moment. And he looked at me, and he pointed at my face, and he said, that's what I'm going to teach you. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, anybody can come in here and put down a few dollars and buy a trick and go home and they read the instructions and they read them once and then they perform it for their family and they think they're a magician. He said, that's just learning a trick. He said, making somebody believe that what they saw was real, that's magic. And I was completely hooked. And I realized that magic and illusion and visual effects and all that stuff were all kind of tied together. And so I had a goal, which was visual effects. I didn't know how I was going to do that because I was in Australia and all of the visual effects stuff in the world was being done in the United States and England. I had to start somewhere. So working at ABC, I was able to take the system that was designed for doing 2D still frame images for graphics and apply it to animation. And I was doing animated visual effects for main title sequences, and it kept on going from stage to stage, and here we are.
That's a great story. And so when I start to look at your credits, I mentioned a few of them in the open, but when you look at your IMDb page, it's a little overwhelming, actually. So let's start with one of the projects that has Florida ties. You worked on Armageddon. Do you have a story about working on that project, or what do you remember about Armageddon?
Armageddon was an amazing experience. I was working at a company called POP Film in Santa Monica, California, and the visual effects supervisor for the film, Pat McClung, was a friend of mine, and the film had gotten into some scheduling issues that were making it very difficult to get things delivered on time, and he asked me if I'd come on board and help. And so I joined the film. I left POP, and I joined the film as the compositing supervisor, and we turned out a lot of shots in like 4 months. It was an incredibly complex film. When I joined the film, there were 2 visual effects houses doing it. Within the first week of me being on it, we split that up and spread it out. And it was one of the first times that a film really went to a lot of houses. And so after 1 week of being on the show, we were then in 21 visual effects houses,
wow,
which was spread all over California. And they were mainly film effects houses. There were some smaller effects houses that were working on it as well, but we spread it out just so that we could get all the work done, because trying to get it all done in one house or 2 houses was going to be impossible. But it was a fantastic experience, and working with Michael Bay was great, and I ended up doing a couple more movies with him, and Pat McClung is an awesome supervisor, and he's become a dear friend over the years. But yeah, just a really fun film.
And you're also involved with an independent film that recently filmed in Florida, with a lot of Film Florida members on the crew, actually. I saw A Man with Yellow Eyes. Tell us a little bit about that film and what you're doing.
This is a really interesting film. It's about a young girl with schizophrenia, and it goes through all the trials and tribulations of somebody who's going through that. But at the same time, she totally believes that something is going on in the house next door, which is not right. And she's trying to draw attention to that. And it's written and directed by Castile Landon, who's like a young director and writer, and I think is going to go far. She's very talented, and the film's really good. It's got Katherine Heigl and Harry Connick Jr., and we're handling the visual effects here. We're actually doing all the visual effects work in Montreal. So it's a great film, and we just saw a full cut of it a couple of days ago, and I think it's going to be liked by everybody.
So let's keep going with a little bit of story time. Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest. Is there something that sticks out to you from working on that film?
Well, when I was doing that, I was working for Industrial Light and Magic, otherwise known as ILM. It's the visual effects company that was started by George Lucas to do the visual effects for Star Wars. That, career-wise, had always been my lifelong dream, to work at ILM and to work on Star Wars. So I went up to ILM to do a 4-week gig on Master and Commander, and 4.5 years later, I had worked on 17 movies, including Star Wars, and worked with George, which was amazing. But toward the end of that period, I worked on Dead Man's Chest. And one of the best things about Dead Man's Chest was working with John Knoll, who was the visual effects supervisor. John's like an absolute guru at ILM, but John and his brother were the guys who invented Photoshop. So, we're dealing with people who really know their stuff. I just remember sitting in dailies and watching the tentacle animation on the pirates and all the alien stuff, kind of alien, they were monsters that were in the movie, but the CG animation that was being done by ILM was so brilliant. And there's something very cool about sitting in a theater with people who worked on movies that you've idolized your whole life, and they're kind of your peers. So that was it was a really fun film, and Johnny Depp as Captain Jack is wonderful always, and good film to work on.
So you had mentioned Star Wars in there. So you worked on Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And talk a little bit about what you did on that film.
That film was, obviously a dream come true to work on Star Wars. One of the things that I was tasked with was creating the look for the holograms. So whenever, say, Yoda was appearing as a hologram sitting in a chair in a council meeting, we had to come up with a look for that. So I designed that, and I was using a system called Inferno, compositing system, and an incredibly powerful compositing system, which internally at ILM is known as Sabre. And the Sabre department were, and still is, a group of really amazing artists. All the people on that team were people who had worked in episodic television and commercials, and we used to working very, very quickly and very super efficiently. In many cases, there would be shots that were being handled by other departments, and for whatever reason, they wouldn't be able to get them done in the time that was needed. And so they would usually come to the Sabre department and say, can you get this done? And we would get it done in a matter of hours or at least a couple of days, much faster than anybody else was doing it. But to work on Star Wars was amazing. I remember one day working on a shot, and it was a hologram shot of Yoda. And I would be working on the shot and sit back and look at it, and working on the shot and sit back and look at it. And all of a sudden I just had this moment. And I looked at the screen and I went, oh, my God, it's Yoda. I'm actually working on a Yoda shot. This is real. And, you never forget that. And I remember going to the cast and crew screening, and the first time you see your name in the credits on a Star Wars movie and realize that that's there forever,
right? You
never forget that, because now you're part of that whole incredible legacy that's Star Wars.
And Adam, you've mentioned, as we're talking here, a couple of different pieces of hardware and software. I know this is kind of an elementary question, but how have you learned everything through the years? I mean, is it literally just sit down, open it up, and start messing around? Or, do you take classes? Do you read books? How does that all come together where you get to the level of expertise that you have?
I read a lot. I'm always reading up on latest technology, but that's what we're capable of doing now. At the time when I was learning originally, there were no schools that taught this. There were no visual effects schools. There were few film schools in the world. There was certainly none in Australia. And so really the only way to learn was just to jump on and dive in and play. And part of that, too, was that there was no industry in place, so there was no preset style of doing anything. So really anything goes. So we would try anything, and some things worked very well and some things didn't work. But it was just a very experimental stage. Now, in later years, things like Harry, which was a compositing system that was used, created also by Quantel, who made the paint box. Harry was the system that I did all the visual effects for Star Trek Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. And I did literally thousands of shots on that system. There was a beautiful system, and then it was kind of surpassed by another system called Flame, which was actually designed in Australia, came to the United States, and we had one of the first flames in the United States at the company that I was working at, which was called Digital Magic. Flame was really incredible because until then, what happened with software that we were using to composite shots was that, a composite shot is a combination of multiple layers, like a background and a midground and a foreground, and then maybe a matte painting and some miniatures, all shot separately. And then the compositor's job is the job of putting all those layers together to make it look like one cohesive shot. In the days of Harry, you would commit one layer on top of the other, but once you did that, it was burnt into that shot, and you couldn't go back and change like a bottom layer without recompositing the entire shot. The beauty of the flame system was that it allowed you to slide back in underneath and change elements and change layers. So then that was for television. Then the company that made Flame came out with Inferno, which was like the beefed up Flame, which was done for feature film. And so we did Titanic and Star Trek First Contact and Armageddon and all those films on Inferno. Really still the best way to get to your original question, the best way to learn is just to jump on and play. I've always joked that the manuals that come with these things make really nice doorstops.
Right.
Because it's rarely that you're going to literally just sit down and start at page one and work your way through a manual. The manuals have all the details in there because they need to be there, but they're really only a resource to go and get specific information if you absolutely need it. And I think the best way to learn is just to jump on the box and play.
Now, when I look at your expertise at a higher level, is there an overarching mindset or philosophy that you bring to each project, or is it truly every project is different and you need to bring something different to the table every time you take on something new?
The latter part of that is true, that every film tends to be its own beast. Every project, whether it's film or television or theme parks or whatever, they all have their own requirements, which are unique to that specific project. The one thing that I have as an overarching kind of philosophy comes from a meeting that I had around 1993 with a man called Linwood Dunn. And around 1926, Lin invented a machine called the Acme Dunn optical printer. And the optical printer was the very first system put together that allowed filmmakers to take multiple layers of film and composite them together. So basically, he created my job. He did the composites on like Gone with the Wind and Citizen Kane and incredible films. And so I said to Lin, if I'm ever going to ask anybody this question, it has to be you. What's the one guiding principle that you would recommend for a long career in visual effects? And he said, oh, that's easy. He said, you spend your entire life doing shots that no one notices. And I said, okay, well, why is that? And he said, well, because, my boy, you only have one purpose in this job, and that's to serve the story. He said, the second that you do a shot which is so spectacular that the audience steps out of it and goes, wow, what a cool effect, you failed because you made it about you. Don't make it about you, make it about the story. And he said, be invisible and you'll be here forever. And so my philosophy overall, no matter what the project is really to make the shots as invisible as they possibly can be to the emotion of the audience, because you don't want them to step out of the story. You want them to be fully immersed in the story. And, that's the philosophy.
It's a great story, and it's actually a very true philosophy. I would agree with that 100%. So, Adam, when you get to your level, I'm sure people come to you to work on projects as opposed to you, hunting them down and trying to look for work. So when someone brings a project to you, what are you looking for before you sign on? Or maybe even more importantly, what are you looking for that isn't there that helps you decide to decline a project?
I always read the script first. And, I think after reading as many scripts as I have over the years, you kind of develop a sense of what's working and what's not. You can kind of tell whether a film is going to be successful or not. I remember getting a call at the last minute to, like, literally on a Saturday. The call said, can you be in New York on Monday to do Birdman? And okay. And I knew nothing about the film. And I read the script on the plane, and I remember thinking to myself, this is going to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. This is just an amazing script. And yes, I'm glad I'm flying there right now. And it did. I think, you look for real quality of writing and quality of character, and you look for moments and characters that the audience are really going to connect with. And those moments are spread throughout a script. They can be visual effects moments, or they can be character moments, or they can just be like little story plot points. But I always love seeing things that I know the audience is going to react with. And when you go to see a movie once it's finished and you're sitting in the back of the theater and you know that a certain sequence or a certain shot or something is coming up, and you're hoping that the audience react a certain way, when 700 people all go at the same time, you just go, okay, good. That worked. Yeah.
So it's interesting that from a visual effects guy, you still believe that the story is still the number one important thing.
Story is the only thing that matters. I think one of the unfortunate things that's happened in film in recent years has been that a lot of filmmaking has become run by money people. It was always run by money people, but the emphasis for how a film is made now is much more geared toward how little it can cost to make for how much it will make them in profits.
Right.
And I've seen scripts come in. I read a script the other day, which was literally only like 70 pages. And I was talking to one of the producers, and I said, so where's the rest of the script? And they said, oh, that's it. And I said, well, no, there should be more than that. And they said, well, there'll be lots of moments, lots of very quiet moments in it. I said, there's going to be a lot of quiet moments in that because, that's like half a script.
Right. 70-page script would be a quick movie.
Yeah, exactly. I think what happens with scripts is they write a script and they think, well, now we're just going to fill it with visual effects because that's what people want to see. And, people love seeing big action hero films and seeing moments that are, big spectacular moments. But if there's no underlying story that supports that, there's kind of no point to the story. And it can get very frustrating when you go to see a movie. I know I'm frustrated when I go and see a movie and there's 2,500 visual effects shots in a film, but there's really no story. And, what we're going to the movies for is to be inspired and to be entertained. And obviously that happens on very many levels. But, I spoke at a convention recently in Brazil, and a young guy came up to me afterwards, and he was thanking me for being there. But he said, I wanted to say something special, which was, I was watching your demo reel, and he said, I realized that you created my childhood. And he said, every single show that I ever loved, you were part of. And he said, whether that was a movie or a TV series. And it hit me like a freight train, because it had never really gelled with me the effect that what we're doing has on people. And, a lot of us get to the point where we're just like churning shots out and it's just, it's a job. But, when people are down or people need to be encouraged or they need to be cheered up, they go to entertainment, whether it's live music or a movie or the theater or whatever. They want to be entertained and they want to be taken out of that moment and taken to a place that can make them happy. And the only thing that really makes that work is to have a strong story.
You're 100% correct. The storytelling can take people from, just like you said, they want to go from the real world that they're in to this outside world that they don't have a care in the world. They don't, you can go into a theater or watch a movie for a couple hours and forget what's going on in the real world. And that's truly the value of what the film industry does. You're right. So when somebody comes to you, and I'm sure you get this a lot, and says, I want to get in the industry, what's your advice? What's the basic career advice to somebody?
It's always the same thing. I say start at the bottom. There's so many kids that go to film schools now and they come out and they want to be the boss straight away.
Right.
I just say to people, that is a mistake, because if all that you've ever known is being the boss, you're never going to understand the needs of the people who are working for you. So go work in a TV station or work for a design company or work for an animation company or a visual effects company, but start at the bottom, start in the vault, like logging videotapes, and and learn what those people do, and then maybe be an assistant editor and learn that, and then maybe become an editor, and then maybe become an animator, and then become a compositor, and then work, if you want to be a visual effects supervisor, work toward that. But don't go straight to that, because the only way that you're going to be respected by the people who work for you, and the only way you're really going to learn your craft, is to learn every step of the way. I've had people work for me and with me over the years, and I say to them, look, the entire process from the writing of the script to the delivery of the movie is, say, as long as a yardstick. And a little 2-inch bit right in the middle is the room that you work in. And you've got to know everything about what goes on inside your room. But the reality of the process is that before it comes into your room, there's a whole slew of techniques and skills that have been applied to make the elements that come into your room. You need to understand what all of those processes are. You don't necessarily need to know how to do them, but it helps. But you need to make yourself fully aware of what all those processes are, so that by the time they're getting to the point where they're doing something that's needing to come to you, you can tell them exactly what they need to do so that it can help you do your job. Likewise, you need to understand all the processes once it leaves your room and gets to the end product, so that you're doing what they need. And I said, unless you really understand those processes before and after your thing, you can't do your job.
I completely agree. In a previous job that I had, I used to interview intern candidates, 50 of them a year. And one of the questions I would ask them is, where do you want to be in 5 years in your career? And you could tell from that one question the people that had a realistic view on their career and the industry versus the ones that were looking to, like you said, jump over 10 steps and just get to the leadership role without learning from the bottom. And you could tell just in somebody's intern interview if they were willing to start at the bottom and do the little things to learn. So what you're saying makes total sense. I totally remember sitting in those interviews thinking, okay, this one gets it, and then the next one is that this one just doesn't have a clue what it's like to really get somewhere far in the industry.
I think there's an interesting example here. When I think back to my graphic design course that I did in Melbourne, when we started that course, there were 79 people in our class, and it was a 5-year course. And at the end of 5 years, there were 8 people left. And
wow.
Now, out of the 8 people, there are 3 of us still in the business. That's a lot of attrition.
That is.
But a lot of that was people going straight out of the course and saying, well, I want to be an art director at an advertising agency. You cannot be, because you don't even have the bandwidth or the knowledge to do that job. And I think this is another big problem in the industry, that, and it gets back to money people running things rather than understanding the needs of creativity. Sometimes you see people coming out of film schools and they're incredibly eager, which is wonderful, but they're also incredibly cheap because they've had no experience. And studios will say, well, we're going to hire that guy because he's going to cost $1.95 an hour versus, whatever you're charging with 40 years of experience. We're going to use him because he's cheap and he's malleable because he's hungry. And so we can kind of mold him into what we want. And they throw that person on a set, and that person who's had no experience on a set is all of a sudden on set, in front of a director, in front of the crew, and in front of actors, being expected to have all the answers. And they've never done it before, and they crash and burn. And they can really hurt productions in doing that because they can hemorrhage the visual effects budget. It doesn't matter what department it is. It happens in all departments. But certainly in visual effects, it can be a very dangerous thing because the budgets are getting tighter and tighter, but the workload is increasing. And the only way that you can really handle that kind of work is to have the experience of knowing what works and what doesn't. And I think it's very dangerous to throw people into the job expecting them to know when they just don't, because you're setting them up to fail.
Well, the adage of you get what you pay for kind of fits in this case. Someone may be half the cost, but they're going to take 4 times the time to get something accomplished, if at all. And so you're completely correct. So speaking of, bringing people in on projects, when you're working as a visual effects supervisor, oftentimes you're obviously leading a team. When you put a team together, besides the obvious of this, somebody have good experience, are they good at what they do? Is there a trait in artists that you look for that you believe will make good teammates when you're putting a group together?
It might sound like a really old school, old fogey kind of opinion, but I really look for artistic skill with real tools. I look to see whether they have real artwork in their portfolio, whether they can draw, whether if you hand them a pencil, can they draw a picture or a portrait or, whatever. Back in the early 90s, we used to affectionately call people like the digital babies, because the digital babies were the ones who only grew up knowing what the buttons were when they pressed the buttons. And if the button said airbrush and you hit airbrush and a soft thing came out, then that was what an airbrush was. The reality is that a real airbrush is an incredibly variable and flexible tool that you can make do a myriad of different styles. But the only way you can do it is to experiment with that tool. And so what I look for is people who have really strong real artistic skill, because then I know that if they've got that, then they're going to be able to push the digital tools to do that.
That makes sense. So without naming names, unless you want to, what's next for you?
I actually can't say right now. There's a couple of projects that I'm talking with. There's one project in London that could be exciting. There's another couple of projects that are coming out of Greece, a couple of horror films, which are potentially very exciting. And then another one that just came up yesterday that is being done in the States. And so, talking, we'll see which one hits first.
Well, when you're able to talk about them, make sure you let us know, and we'll let people know to be out there looking for them.
Absolutely, I will do.
Adam, thanks for sharing your expertise with us today. I know people listening will appreciate the stories and the career advice.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me, John. It's a pleasure to be on the Film Florida podcast, and I look forward to hearing from you again.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at teespring.com/stores/Film Florida. And please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.